Sarah Martinez had always been punctual. Throughout her 26 years of life, she prided herself on being the person who arrived early, stayed late, and never missed important commitments. So when she walked into the bright fluorescent-lit gymnasium at Riverside Community Center that Tuesday morning, 15 minutes after the physical therapy session had already begun, she could feel every pair of eyes turning toward her. The squeaking of her sneakers against the polished floor seemed to echo louder than it should have as she made her way across the room. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the lead physiotherapist, paused mid-sentence while demonstrating a stretching exercise to the group of 12 patients. The silence that followed felt heavy and uncomfortable, broken only by the soft hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. Well, came a voice from the corner of the room. It belonged to Marcus Thompson, a retired construction worker in his 50s who had been attending these sessions for 3 months following a workplace injury to his lower back. Marcus had a reputation for his sharp tongue and little patience for what he considered weakness or excuses. Look who decided to grace us with her presence. Must be nice to show up whenever you feel like it. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as she quietly took her place on an empty exercise mat near the back of the room. She kept her thick winter coat zipped up tight, despite the warmth of the gymnasium. The coat was oversized and bulky, making her appear larger than she actually was, and she seemed to shrink into it even further as the attention focused on her. "I'm sorry I'm late," Sarah said softly, her voice barely audible above the background noise. "There was an issue with the bus, and then I had to wait for another one." Dr. Walsh nodded politely and continued with the session, but Sarah could sense the judgment in the room. This wasn't the first time she had been late. Over the past 6 weeks of attending these sessions, she had missed 2 completely and arrived late to 4 others. Each absence or tardiness had been met with increasing frustration from both the medical staff and her fellow patients. The truth was, Sarah's transportation issues were just one small part of a much larger and more complex situation that nobody in that room could have imagined. But she wasn't ready to share that truth yet. She wasn't sure if she would ever be ready. As the session progressed, Sarah struggled to keep up with the exercises. Simple movements that the others performed with relative ease seemed to cause her significant discomfort. When Dr. Walsh instructed the group to do standing balance exercises, Sarah remained seated on her mat, claiming she was feeling dizzy. When they moved to resistance band work, she participated half-heartedly, stopping frequently to rest. "Come on, Martinez," Marcus called out during a particularly challenging set of core strengthening exercises. "You're not even trying. The rest of us are here working our tails off, and you're just going through the motions. Maybe if you showed up on time and actually participated, you'd see some improvement." Linda Foster, an elderly woman recovering from hip replacement surgery, nodded in agreement. "Honey, I know these exercises are hard, but you can't expect to get better if you don't put in the effort. At my age, if I can push through the discomfort, surely someone your age can do the same." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly. She had heard variations of these comments before, not just here, but in other areas of her life. Family members who questioned why she couldn't hold down a steady job. Friends who stopped inviting her to social gatherings because she canceled so frequently. Co-workers at her part-time positions who whispered about her frequent sick days and early departures. The assumptions people made about her were always the same. She was lazy, uncommitted, making excuses, or seeking attention. Nobody ever considered that there might be invisible struggles that weren't immediately apparent to the casual observer. Society had conditioned people to expect that all disabilities and health conditions should be visible and obvious. If someone looked relatively young and healthy on the surface, they must be fine, right? After the session ended, Sarah remained on her mat as the others gathered their belongings and chatted amongst themselves. Dr. Walsh approached her with a clipboard in hand and a concerned but slightly frustrated expression on her face. "Sarah, I need to talk with you about your attendance and participation," Dr. Walsh said, sitting down on a nearby chair. "I understand that everyone heals at their own pace, but I'm seeing some concerning patterns here. You've missed several sessions, you're frequently late, and when you are here, you don't seem to be giving your full effort to the prescribed exercises." Sarah looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. "I know it seems like I'm not trying, but I really am doing my best." "I believe you think you are," Dr. Walsh replied. "But recovery from your car accident requires consistent effort and attendance. The insurance company is also starting to ask questions about your progress. They need to see measurable improvement to continue authorizing these sessions. The car accident. That's what everyone assumed was Sarah's primary issue. 6 months ago, she had been involved in a minor collision at a busy intersection downtown. Her vehicle had been rear-ended while she was stopped at a red light, and she had suffered what appeared to be relatively minor injuries, some bruising, mild whiplash, and general soreness that was expected to resolve with time and physical therapy. But the accident had been just one more complication in an already difficult situation that had been developing for over 2 years. The real source of Sarah's struggles was something that couldn't be seen in X-rays or MRI scans, something that didn't show up in blood tests or physical examinations, and something that many medical professionals were still learning to understand and treat effectively. Dr. Walsh, Sarah began hesitantly, there are some things about my situation that are more complicated than what's in my file. The car accident wasn't really the beginning of my problems. It was just the thing that finally forced me to seek help for issues I'd been dealing with for a long time. Dr. Walsh's expression softened slightly. What kind of issues are you talking about, Sarah? Sarah glanced around the gymnasium to make sure the other patients had left before continuing. I know this is going to sound like an excuse, and I know people are already frustrated with me, but I've been dealing with some health problems that aren't really visible. I've seen multiple doctors, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what's going on, but it affects my energy levels, my ability to concentrate, and sometimes even my ability to function normally from day to day. Have you been diagnosed with any specific conditions? Dr. Walsh asked, making notes on her clipboard. That's part of the problem, Sarah replied. I've had so many tests done, and most of them come back normal or inconclusive. I've seen my primary care doctor, a neurologist, a rheumatologist, and even a psychiatrist because some people suggested my symptoms might be psychological. Everyone has different theories, but no one has been able to give me clear answers. Dr. Walsh set down her clipboard and looked at Sarah more intently. Can you describe what you're experiencing? Maybe there's something we can do to modify your treatment plan to better accommodate your needs. Sarah took a deep breath. This was always the hardest part, trying to explain symptoms that seemed to change from day to day and that often sounded vague or inconsistent when spoken out loud. Some days I wake up feeling like I've been hit by a truck, even if I've slept for 10 hours. My muscles ache in ways that don't make sense, and I feel exhausted before I've even gotten out of bed. Other days, I might feel okay in the morning, but then, suddenly, feel like all my energy has been drained out of me by mid-afternoon. Sometimes my joints hurt so badly that it's difficult to walk or climb stairs, but then, the next day they might feel fine. She paused, watching Dr. Walsh's face for any sign of skepticism or dismissal. When she didn't see any immediate judgment, she continued, I also have problems with what my doctor calls brain fog. I'll be in the middle of a conversation or trying to complete a task, and suddenly, it's like my mind just goes blank. I can't remember what I was saying or doing, and it takes me a while to get back on track. It's incredibly frustrating and embarrassing, especially when it happens at work or in social situations. Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. Have any of the doctors you've seen mentioned fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome? Some of what you're describing sounds consistent with those conditions. Fibromyalgia has been mentioned, Sarah said, but the doctor who brought it up said the diagnosis was controversial and that some physicians don't even believe it's a real condition. He suggested I try some lifestyle changes first, better sleep, regular exercise, stress reduction, before pursuing that diagnosis further. And how has that approach been working for you? Sarah let out a small, bitter laugh. Well, here I am in physical therapy, trying to exercise regularly, and everyone thinks I'm lazy or faking it. The better sleep is nearly impossible because the pain and discomfort often keep me awake at night, or I'll fall asleep fine, but wake up multiple times feeling restless. As for stress reduction, she gestured around the empty gymnasium. Being constantly judged and criticized for things I can't always control isn't exactly helping with that. Dr. Walsh was quiet for a moment, processing what Sarah had shared. I'm going to be honest with you, Sarah. I don't have extensive experience with conditions like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome. Most of my training and practice has focused on rehabilitation following specific injuries or surgeries. But what you're describing sounds legitimate, and I think we need to approach your treatment differently. What do you mean? Well, first, I think it would be helpful if you could bring documentation from your other doctors about the symptoms and conditions you're dealing with. That way, I can better understand how to modify your exercises and expectations. Second, I think we should have a conversation with the other patients in your group about invisible disabilities and chronic conditions. Some of the comments they've made aren't appropriate, regardless of what your situation is. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was the first time in months that a healthcare provider had really listened to what she was saying without immediately dismissing her concerns or suggesting that her problems were primarily psychological. But Dr. Walsh, Sarah said, I'm worried that if I start talking about these invisible health issues, people will just think I'm making excuses or looking for sympathy. I've had that reaction from family members and friends. They see me on my good days when I'm functioning relatively normally, and they can't understand why I can't just push through the bad days. That's unfortunately a common experience for people dealing with invisible or chronic conditions, Dr. Walsh replied. Society tends to have a very narrow understanding of what illness and disability look like. If someone doesn't use a wheelchair or have some other obvious sign of a medical issue, people assume they're fine. Sarah nodded vigorously. Exactly. And then, when I do try to explain what I'm going through, I can see people's eyes glaze over or they start looking at me like I'm a hypochondriac. It's almost easier to just let people think I'm lazy or unreliable than to try to explain something that even I don't fully understand. But that's not fair to you, Dr. Walsh said firmly. And it's not helping your recovery or your overall well-being. You shouldn't have to choose between being honest about your health and being treated with respect and understanding. As they continued talking, Sarah felt some of the tension she'd been carrying for months begin to ease. For the first time since starting these physical therapy sessions, she felt like she might have an ally rather than another person judging her limitations and struggles. But she also knew that the real test would come when she had to face Marcus, Linda, and the other patients again. Would they be willing to listen and try to understand? Or would they continue to see her as someone making excuses for poor attendance and lack of effort? The winter coat she wore to every session had become like a security blanket, something to hide behind when the world felt too overwhelming or judgmental. But maybe, eventually, she would find the courage to take it off and reveal not just her physical self, but the truth about her invisible struggles that had been shaping every aspect of her life. As Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the gymnasium, she made a mental note to call her primary care doctor that afternoon. It was time to get serious about documenting her symptoms and pursuing a clearer diagnosis, not just for the sake of physical therapy, but for her own peace of mind and ability to advocate for herself. The journey toward understanding and acceptance, both from others and from herself, was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had taken a small but important step in the right direction. The afternoon sun streaming through the gymnasium windows felt warm on her face as she headed toward the exit, still wearing her thick winter coat, but feeling just a little bit lighter underneath it. All. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's conversation with Dr. Walsh, and the atmosphere in the physical therapy group had become even more tense. Sarah had managed to attend every session during that time, arriving punctually and participating to the best of her ability. However, her efforts seemed to go unnoticed by most of her fellow patients, who had grown increasingly vocal about their frustrations with what they perceived as her lack of commitment. During a particularly challenging morning session focused on cardiovascular endurance, Sarah found herself struggling more than usual. The exercises that day included alternating between stationary bikes, treadmills, and rowing machines for 15-minute intervals. While the other patients powered through their routines with varying degrees of success, Sarah found herself stopping frequently, her face pale, and her breathing labored despite what appeared to be minimal exertion. "This is ridiculous," Marcus announced loudly enough for everyone to hear as he continued pedaling steadily on his bike. "We're all here because we want to get better, and we're being held back by someone who clearly doesn't want to be here." Linda, who was walking briskly on the treadmill next to Sarah's stationary bike, shook her head in agreement. "I hate to say it, but Marcus has a point. Sarah, honey, you're young and healthy looking. If an old lady like me can keep up with these exercises, there's no reason you can't push yourself a little harder." Robert Chun, a middle-aged accountant recovering from a shoulder injury sustained in a skiing accident, decided to join the conversation. "Maybe the problem is that some people get too comfortable relying on insurance money and disability claims. When there's no real incentive to get better, why bother putting in the effort?" Sarah felt her heart rate spike, and not from the exercise. The casual cruelty of Robert's comment hit her like a physical blow. She stopped pedaling altogether and gripped the handlebars of the stationary bike, trying to steady herself as a wave of dizziness washed over her. "I'm not on disability," she said quietly, though her voice was shaky. "And I'm not getting any insurance money beyond what covers these sessions." "Then what's your excuse?" Marcus pressed. "Because from where we're sitting, it looks like you're just going through the motions. Some of us have real jobs to get back to and real responsibilities. We can't afford to waste time." Dr. Walsh, who had been working with another patient on the far side of the room, noticed the commotion and quickly made her way over to the group. "Is everything all right here?" "We were just discussing motivation and commitment," Marcus said with a sardonic smile. "Apparently, some people have different definitions of those words than others." Dr. Walsh looked at Sarah, who was now sitting motionless on the bike with tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Sarah, why don't you step outside with me for a moment?" As they walked toward the exit of the gymnasium, Sarah could hear the whispered conversations starting up behind them. She knew that her emotional response would only fuel more speculation about her mental state and the legitimacy of her health concerns. Once they were in the hallway outside the gym, Dr. Walsh guided Sarah to a small seating area near the vending machines. "Talk to me. What's going on today?" Sarah wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her ever-present winter coat. "I woke up this morning feeling like I'd been in a car accident all over again. Every muscle in my body aches, and I feel like I'm trying to move through thick mud. But I came anyway because I knew if I missed another session, it would just make everything worse." "Have you been keeping that symptom diary we discussed?" Dr. Walsh asked. Sarah nodded and pulled a small notebook from her pocket. "I've been tracking everything: sleep patterns, pain levels, energy levels, what I eat, the weather, stress levels, everything. I brought copies of my recent medical records too, like you suggested." Dr. Walsh accepted the notebook and medical file that Sarah handed her. "I'm going to review these this evening, and I think it's time we had that group discussion about invisible disabilities that we talked about. But first, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay, are you hiding anything about your condition that might help me understand what we're dealing with? I know you mentioned seeing multiple doctors and getting inconclusive results, but sometimes patients don't share everything because they're afraid of being judged or not believed." Sarah hesitated for a long moment. She had been debating for weeks whether to reveal the full extent of what she'd been experiencing, knowing that some of her symptoms might sound bizarre or unbelievable to someone who hadn't experienced them firsthand. "There are some things I haven't mentioned," she admitted finally. "Partly because they sound strange even to me, and partly because I wasn't sure they were related to everything else." "Try me." Sarah took a deep breath. "Sometimes I have episodes where my heart starts racing for no apparent reason. Not like when you exercise or get scared, but like it's trying to beat out of my chest. During those episodes, I also get really dizzy and feel like I might faint. It can last anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour." Dr. Walsh made notes on her clipboard. "How often does this happen?" "Maybe 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more. It's unpredictable. I might be sitting quietly watching TV, or standing in line at the grocery store, or trying to sleep. There doesn't seem to be any consistent trigger." "Have you mentioned this to any of your doctors?" "I mentioned it to my primary care doctor, and she had me wear a heart monitor for 2 weeks. But, of course, during those 2 weeks, I barely had any episodes. The few times it did happen, the monitor didn't show anything that seemed concerning to the cardiologist who reviewed the results." Dr. Walsh nodded thoughtfully. "What else haven't you mentioned?" "Temperature regulation issues," Sarah continued. "I'm almost always cold, even when everyone else is comfortable or warm. That's why I wear this coat everywhere. But then, sometimes, usually during those heart-racing episodes, I'll suddenly feel like I'm burning up from the inside. I'll be sweating and feeling overheated while simultaneously having cold hands and feet." "That's interesting. Anything else?" Sarah looked around to make sure they were still alone in the hallway. "This is the part that makes me sound crazy, but sometimes I have trouble with basic coordination and balance. Not just feeling unsteady, but like my brain and my body aren't communicating properly. I'll reach for a glass and miss it completely, or I'll try to walk in a straight line and veer off to one side without realizing it." "How long have you been experiencing these symptoms?" "The coordination issues started about 6 months before the car accident. The heart racing and temperature problems have been going on for almost 2 years. But everything got worse after the accident, which is why I assumed it was all related to the whiplash and trauma." Dr. Walsh was quiet for several minutes, reviewing her notes, and the the medical records Sarah had provided. Sarah, I think we need to explore the possibility that you're dealing with something called dysautonomia. It's a dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, which controls things like heart rate, blood pressure, temperature regulation, and digestion. I've never heard of that. Most people haven't, including many healthcare providers. It's often misdiagnosed or undiagnosed because the symptoms can be so varied, and they often come and go unpredictably. There are several different types of dysautonomia, and one called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, might explain some of what you're experiencing. Sarah felt a mixture of hope and skepticism. But wouldn't something like that show up on tests? I've had so many blood tests and scans. Not necessarily. POTS is diagnosed primarily through a specific type of test called a tilt table test or a poor man's POTS test, which measures how your heart rate and blood pressure respond when you change positions from lying down to standing. Standard blood work and imaging usually come back normal. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like someone was taking her symptoms seriously and offering a potential explanation that made sense. What would that mean for my treatment here? It would mean we need to completely modify your exercise program, Dr. Walsh explained. People with POTS often struggle with traditional cardiovascular exercise because it can trigger their symptoms. But there are specific exercise protocols designed for people with dysautonomia that can actually help improve their condition over time. And the other patients? Are you still planning to talk to them about invisible disabilities? Dr. Walsh's expression became more serious. Absolutely. What happened in there today was unacceptable. Chronic illness shaming has no place in a medical setting, and I should have addressed it sooner. But I think it would be helpful if you were willing to share some of your story with the group. Sarah felt her stomach clench with anxiety. I don't know if I'm ready for that. What if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm just making excuses? Then, that's their problem, not yours. You have the right to receive medical care without harassment or judgment. And who knows? Your story might help someone else in the group who's been struggling with their own invisible challenges. As they sat in the quiet hallway, Sarah reflected on the past few months and how isolating it had been to deal with unexplained symptoms while also facing constant criticism and skepticism from others. The possibility that there might be a name for what she was experiencing, and, more importantly, treatment options specifically designed for her condition, felt like a ray of hope in what had been a very dark period. Dr. Walsh, if I do have POTS or dysautonomia, does that explain why I'm always so cold? And why exercise makes me feel worse instead of better? It absolutely could. People with POTS often have problems with blood flow and circulation, which can cause temperature regulation issues and cold extremities. And traditional exercise recommendations that work for healthy people can actually worsen symptoms for people with dysautonomia, at least initially. So all this time when people were telling me I just needed to push through and exercise more, they were unknowingly giving you advice that could have been making your condition worse. It's not their fault. They didn't know what they were dealing with. But it's also not your fault that their well-meaning advice wasn't helping. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that there might be an explanation for her struggles, anger that she had endured months of judgment and criticism, and fear about what would happen next. What do I do now? First, I'm going to refer you to a specialist who has experience with dysautonomia and POTS. Getting a proper diagnosis will be important for your long-term health management. Second, I'm going to research exercise protocols for people with your suspected condition so we can modify your treatment plan immediately. And third, we're going to have that conversation with your therapy group. Today, if you're willing, yes. I think it's important to address the situation sooner rather than later. The comments and attitudes you've been facing aren't just hurtful. They could be interfering with your recovery. Sarah nodded slowly. Okay, but I want to keep my coat on during the discussion. I know it might seem silly, but it makes me feel more secure. That's perfectly fine. You should do whatever makes you feel comfortable and safe. As they prepared to return to the gymnasium, Dr. Walsh placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah, I want you to know that I believe you. Your symptoms are real, your struggles are valid, and you deserve to be treated with respect and compassion. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. For Sarah, those words were almost as healing as any medical treatment could be. She had spent so long questioning her own experiences and wondering if she was somehow exaggerating or imagining her symptoms that having a medical professional validate her reality felt profound. When they walked back into the gymnasium, the other patients were finishing up their cardiovascular exercises and transitioning to the cool-down portion of the session. Sarah noticed that the conversation stopped abruptly when she and Dr. Walsh entered the room, confirming her suspicion that she had been the topic of discussion while they were gone. "Everyone, please gather around," Dr. Walsh announced. "Before we finish today's session, I'd like to have a group discussion about something important." As the patients arranged themselves in a circle on their exercise mats, Sarah could feel her heart rate beginning to spike, not from POTS this time, but from pure anxiety about what was about to happen. She pulled her winter coat tighter around herself and tried to prepare mentally for what might be the most difficult conversation of her life. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: the support of a healthcare provider who believed her and was willing to advocate for her. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The circle of patients settled onto their mats with varying degrees of curiosity and resistance. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest and rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed at having their session interrupted for what he assumed would be another lecture about commitment and attendance. Linda fidgeted with her water bottle, occasionally glancing at Sarah with a mixture of concern and skepticism. Robert checked his phone, making it obvious that he considered this discussion an unwelcome delay in his busy schedule. Dr. Walsh positioned herself so she could see everyone in the circle and began with a calm but serious tone. "I want to talk with all of you today about something that affects millions of people but is often misunderstood: invisible disabilities and chronic health conditions." "Is this because Sarah's been crying again?" Marcus interjected. "Look, we've all been trying to be patient, but at some point, you have to take responsibility for your own recovery." "Actually, Marcus, that kind of attitude is exactly why we need to have this conversation," Dr. Walsh responded firmly. "Before I go any further, I want each of you to consider this question. How many of you have ever experienced a health problem that wasn't immediately obvious to other people?" The question seemed to catch several group members off guard. Linda raised her hand tentatively. "Well, I suppose before my hip replacement, I was dealing with chronic pain for months that people couldn't see just by looking at me." "Thank you for sharing that, Linda. What was that experience like?" Linda thought for a moment. "It was frustrating. People would see me walking around and assume I was fine, but every step was painful. I remember my own daughter telling me I was being dramatic about it until she came with me to a doctor's appointment and heard the physician explain what was happening to my joint." Dr. Walsh nodded. "Anyone else?" Robert reluctantly spoke up. "I deal with migraines, and people at work sometimes think I'm just trying to get out of meetings when I say I need to go home because of a headache. They don't understand that it's not just a regular headache, it's debilitating." "That's another perfect example," Dr. Walsh said. "Now I want you to imagine living with symptoms that are not only invisible to others, but also difficult for medical professionals to diagnose or understand. Symptoms that come and go unpredictably, that don't show up clearly on standard tests, and that significantly impact your daily life." The group was quiet now, and Sarah could feel the energy in the room shifting slightly. Dr. Walsh continued. "Sarah has been brave enough to share some information about her health struggles with me, and I've asked her if she would be willing to help educate all of us about what it's like to live with an invisible chronic condition. Sarah, would you like to tell them about your experiences?" Sarah's hands were trembling as she looked around the circle. Every face was turned toward her, and she could feel her heart rate beginning to accelerate. She knew that once she started talking, there would be no taking back what she revealed. "I know you all think I'm lazy or making excuses," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I understand why it looks that way. But I want you to know that showing up here, even when I'm late or can't participate fully, represents enormous effort for me." Marcus started to interrupt, but Dr. Walsh held up a hand to stop him. "Let her finish." Sarah took a shaky breath and continued. 2 years ago, I started experiencing symptoms that I couldn't explain. My heart would suddenly start racing for no reason, sometimes reaching 150 beats per minute while I was just sitting still. I would feel dizzy and like I might faint. My hands and feet were always cold, but sometimes I would feel like I was burning up from the inside. She paused, watching the faces around her for signs of disbelief or eye-rolling. To her surprise, most of the group members seemed to be listening intently. I also started having problems with coordination and balance. I would reach for things and miss them completely, or I would be walking and suddenly veer off to one side without realizing it. And the fatigue. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. The fatigue is like nothing I had ever experienced. Some days I wake up feeling like I haven't slept in a week, even after sleeping for 10 hours. Linda leaned forward slightly. Have doctors been able to figure out what's causing all of this? That's been the hardest part, Sarah replied. I've seen so many specialists, and I've had countless tests done. Most of them come back normal, which should be good news, but it just left me feeling like I was going crazy. People started suggesting that my symptoms were psychological, that I was stressed or depressed or seeking attention. Robert's expression had softened considerably. That must have been incredibly isolating. It was. And then, when I started coming here after the car accident, I could see that all of you were judging me for my poor attendance and lack of participation. But what you didn't know is that the car accident actually made all of my existing symptoms worse. Some days, just getting dressed and taking the bus to get here feels like running a marathon. Marcus shifted uncomfortably on his mat. Why didn't you just tell us this from the beginning? Because I was afraid of exactly the reaction I've been getting, Sarah said, her voice getting stronger. When people can't see your disability, they assume you're faking it. I've lost jobs because of my health issues. I've had family members accuse me of being dramatic. I've had friends stop inviting me to things because I've had to cancel so many times. Dr. Walsh decided it was time to share some of the medical information she had learned. What Sarah is describing sounds consistent with a condition called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. It's a form of dysautonomia, which means the autonomic nervous system isn't functioning properly. I've never heard of that, Linda said. Most people haven't, including many healthcare providers. The autonomic nervous system controls involuntary functions like heart rate, blood pressure, temperature regulation, and digestion. When it's not working correctly, it can cause a wide range of symptoms that seem unrelated but are actually connected. Marcus looked genuinely confused. But she looks normal. I mean, she doesn't look sick. That's exactly the point, Dr. Walsh explained. Chronic illnesses like POTS, fibromyalgia, lupus, multiple sclerosis, and dozens of others often don't have visible signs. People with these conditions may look perfectly healthy on the outside while struggling with debilitating symptoms on the inside. Sarah decided to share more details about her daily experience. Let me give you an example of what a typical day looks like for me. Yesterday morning, I woke up feeling relatively okay. I was able to shower and get dressed without too much difficulty. But by the time I got to work, I have a part-time job at a call center. My heart was racing, and I felt dizzy every time I stood up from my desk. She continued, around lunchtime, I started having trouble concentrating. It's like someone turned down the volume on my brain, and I couldn't process information normally. My supervisor noticed that I was making mistakes on simple tasks that I usually handle easily. By 3 o'clock, I was so exhausted that I felt like I might collapse if I didn't sit down. Did you go home early? Robert asked. No, because I've already used up most of my sick days this year, and I can't afford to lose this job. So I pushed through until the end of my shift, but by the time I got home, I was completely depleted. I couldn't even heat up a frozen dinner. I just ate crackers and went to bed at 7 p.m. The group was silent for a moment, processing what Sarah had shared. Finally, Linda spoke up. Honey, I had no idea you were dealing with all of that. I feel terrible about some of the things I've said. I don't want you to feel terrible, Sarah replied. I just want you to understand that when I miss sessions or can't participate fully, it's not because I don't care about getting better. It's because my body is fighting against me in ways that aren't visible to anyone else. Dr. Walsh decided to address the exercise component specifically. This is why it's so important for healthcare providers to understand different conditions and modify treatment accordingly. Traditional exercise recommendations that work well for people recovering from injuries or surgeries can actually worsen symptoms for people with conditions like POTS. What do you mean? Marcus asked. People with POTS often have problems with blood flow and circulation. When they do cardiovascular exercise, especially in an upright position, it can trigger their symptoms: heart racing, dizziness, fatigue. So when we've been encouraging Sarah to push through and work harder on the bikes and treadmills, we may have been unknowingly making her condition worse. Sarah nodded emphatically. Exactly. Every time I tried to keep up with the cardio exercises, I would feel awful for hours afterward. But I thought that meant I was just out of shape and needed to push harder. Robert looked genuinely remorseful. I made that comment about insurance money and disability claims. I'm sorry. I had no idea what you were dealing with. It's okay, Sarah said. I understand why you would assume that. Society teaches us that all disabilities should be visible and that people who look healthy must be fine. But the reality is that millions of people are walking around with invisible struggles every single day. Dr. Walsh decided to expand the discussion to help the group understand the broader implications. Invisible disabilities are incredibly common. Conditions like diabetes, epilepsy, chronic pain, autoimmune diseases, mental health conditions, and neurological disorders affect people's daily lives in significant ways, but they're not always apparent to casual observers. So what can we do differently? Linda asked. I mean, how do we support people who might be dealing with invisible health issues? The most important thing is to avoid making assumptions, Dr. Walsh replied. If someone says they're struggling or can't do something, believe them. Don't assume that looking healthy means being healthy. And remember that everyone's experience with illness and recovery is different. Sarah decided to share one more aspect of her experience. There's also the issue of inconsistency, which makes invisible illness even harder for people to understand. I might have a really good day where I feel almost normal, and then, the next day, I can barely function. From the outside, it looks like I'm being inconsistent or unreliable, but really it's just the nature of my condition. That must be confusing for you too, Robert observed. It is. I never know how I'm going to feel from day to day, or even from hour to hour. It makes it impossible to make plans or commitments with any confidence. I've had to cancel so many social events, work shifts, and medical appointments because I woke up feeling terrible when I had been fine the day before. Marcus, who had been mostly quiet during the latter part of the discussion, finally spoke up. Sarah, I owe you an apology. I've been really hard on you, and I didn't understand what was going on. I still don't really understand your condition, but I believe that you're dealing with something difficult. Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot. Dr. Walsh looked around the group. I want all of you to know that we're going to be modifying Sarah's exercise program based on what we've learned about her condition. She'll still be participating in sessions, but her exercises will be different from yours. I hope you'll be supportive of that. Of course, Linda said immediately. Whatever she needs. As the discussion began to wind down, Sarah felt emotionally drained but also relieved. She had shared more about her condition in the past hour than she had with anyone except her doctors. The response from the group had been better than she had dared to hope. But she was also aware that she was still wearing her thick winter coat, zipped up tight despite the warmth of the gymnasium. The coat had become a security blanket, a way to hide not just from the cold that plagued her constantly, but from the judgment and scrutiny of others. She wasn't ready to take it off yet, but maybe someday she would be. Dr. Walsh concluded the session with some resources for the group to learn more about invisible disabilities and chronic illnesses. As the patients began to gather their belongings and prepare to leave, several of them approached Sarah to offer additional words of support and encouragement. For the first time since beginning physical therapy, Sarah left the gymnasium feeling hopeful about returning for the next session. The journey toward proper diagnosis and treatment was still ahead of her, but at least now she had allies rather than critics in her recovery process. The winter coat remained zipped tight as she walked to the bus stop, but underneath it, Sarah felt a little bit warmer than she had in months. 6 weeks after the group discussion in physical therapy, Sarah found herself sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a cardiologist who specialized in autonomic disorders. The referral from Dr. Walsh had taken nearly a month to process, and Sarah had spent that time researching POTS and dysautonomia with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The physical therapy sessions had become much more bearable since her conversation with the group. Marcus, Linda, and Robert had all made efforts to be more supportive and understanding. Dr. Walsh had indeed modified Sarah's exercise program, focusing on recumbent exercises and gradual conditioning that was less likely to trigger her symptoms. For the first time in months, Sarah was actually seeing some small improvements in her stamina and overall well-being. But she still wore her heavy winter coat to every session, and she still struggled with the unpredictable nature of her symptoms. Some days were better than others, but the underlying issues remained unresolved. Today, she hoped, might finally provide some answers. Sarah Martinez? A nurse called from the doorway leading to the examination rooms. Sarah stood up carefully, mindful of the dizziness that often accompanied changes in position, and followed the nurse down a corridor lined with posters about heart health and cardiovascular conditions. She was surprised to see that some of the posters actually mentioned POTS and other autonomic disorders, the first time she had seen her suspected condition acknowledged in a medical setting. The nurse led her to a room equipped with what looked like a specialized examination table that could be tilted at various angles. Dr. Rodriguez will be with you shortly. She's going to want to do some baseline measurements and possibly a tilt table test today, depending on what she finds. Sarah settled into a chair and tried to calm her nerves. She had read about tilt table tests online and knew they could be uncomfortable for people with POTS, sometimes triggering the very symptoms they were designed to measure. But she also knew that getting an accurate diagnosis was crucial for her long-term health and quality of life. Dr. Rodriguez knocked gently before entering the room. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an immediately reassuring presence. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Dr. Rodriguez. I've reviewed the referral from Dr. Walsh and the medical records you provided. I understand you've been dealing with some challenging and unexplained symptoms for quite some time." "Yes," Sarah replied. "It's been almost 2 years now, and it's been really difficult not knowing what's wrong with me." "I can imagine. Tell me, in your own words, what your main concerns are and how they're affecting your daily life." Sarah had told her story so many times now that she had developed a somewhat systematic way of explaining her symptoms. The biggest issues are heart palpitations, dizziness, fatigue, temperature regulation problems, and brain fog. They all seem to be connected somehow, but no one has been able to figure out why. Dr. Rodriguez nodded as she made notes. "Let's start with the heart palpitations. Can you describe what they feel like and when they typically occur?" "It feels like my heart is trying to beat out of my chest. Sometimes it happens when I stand up quickly, but other times it seems completely random. I can be sitting quietly watching TV, and suddenly, my heart rate will spike to 140 or 150 beats per minute for no apparent reason." "How long do these episodes typically last?" "Anywhere from a few minutes to over an hour. During the longer episodes, I usually feel dizzy and weak, and sometimes I get really sweaty even though I'm cold." Dr. Rodriguez continued taking notes. "And the temperature regulation issues?" Sarah pulled her coat tighter around herself. "I'm cold almost all the time. Even when it's warm outside, I need to wear layers. My hands and feet are always freezing. But then, during the heart-racing episodes, I'll suddenly feel like I'm burning up from the inside, even though my hands and feet are still cold." "That's very consistent with what we see in autonomic dysfunction," Dr. Rodriguez said. "What about the brain fog?" "It's like someone turns down the volume on my brain. I'll be in the middle of a conversation or trying to do a task at work, and suddenly, I can't think clearly. I lose my train of thought, I can't find the right words, and I have trouble processing information. It's incredibly frustrating and embarrassing." Dr. Rodriguez set down her pen and looked at Sarah directly. "Based on what you're describing and the information in your referral, I strongly suspect you have POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. It's a form of dysautonomia that affects the autonomic nervous system's ability to regulate heart rate and blood pressure when you change positions." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So there really is something wrong? I'm not just imagining all of this." "Absolutely not. POTS is a real, measurable condition that affects millions of people, though it's often underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed. The symptoms you're describing are textbook POTS. But why did it take so long for anyone to consider this diagnosis?" Dr. Rodriguez sighed. "Unfortunately, many healthcare providers aren't familiar with POTS and other autonomic disorders. Medical schools don't always provide comprehensive education about these conditions, and because the symptoms can be so varied and seemingly unrelated, patients often get shuffled between different specialists who only look at their particular area of expertise." She continued, "A cardiologist might focus on the heart rate issues, a neurologist might look for structural brain problems, a psychiatrist might consider anxiety disorders. But dysautonomia affects multiple systems, so it requires a more comprehensive approach." "So what happens now?" "I'd like to do a formal tilt table test to confirm the diagnosis, but honestly, based on your symptoms and history, I'm quite confident that's what we're dealing with. The good news is that POTS is manageable with the right treatment approach." Dr. Rodriguez explained the tilt table test procedure. "We'll have you lie flat on this special table for about 20 minutes while we monitor your heart rate and blood pressure. Then, we'll gradually tilt the table upright to simulate standing, and we'll continue monitoring your vital signs. In people with POTS, we typically see a significant increase in heart rate when they're tilted upright." Sarah agreed to proceed with the test, and Dr. Rodriguez's nurse helped her get positioned on the table. Electrodes were attached to her chest to monitor her heart rhythm, and a blood pressure cuff was placed on her arm. "Try to relax as much as possible," Dr. Rodriguez instructed. "We'll start with you lying completely flat." For the first 20 minutes, Sarah's heart rate remained relatively stable around 75 beats per minute. She actually felt more comfortable than usual, lying flat with her legs slightly elevated. Dr. Rodriguez explained that this was common for people with POTS. Horizontal positions often provided relief from symptoms. Okay, now we're going to gradually tilt the table upright. Let me know if you start feeling any of your usual symptoms. As the table slowly moved toward an upright position, Sarah could immediately feel changes in her body. Within just a few minutes of being tilted to about 70 degrees, her heart rate jumped to 120 beats per minute. "I'm starting to feel dizzy," Sarah reported, "and my heart is racing." "That's exactly what we would expect to see with POTS," Dr. Rodriguez said, monitoring the readings on her equipment. "Your heart rate has increased by more than 45 beats per minute, which meets the diagnostic criteria." As the test continued, Sarah's heart rate climbed to 135 beats per minute, and she began experiencing all of her familiar symptoms: dizziness, nausea, a feeling of overheating despite being cold, and difficulty concentrating. "I think we can stop the test now," Dr. Rodriguez said after about 10 minutes in the upright position. "We have all the information we need for a diagnosis." As the table was lowered back to a horizontal position, Sarah felt immediate relief. Her heart rate began to decrease, and the dizziness subsided. "So it's definitely POTS?" Sarah asked. "Yes, without a doubt. Your heart rate increased by 60 beats per minute when you were tilted upright, and you experienced the classic constellation of symptoms. This explains everything you've been dealing with." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at finally having a definitive diagnosis, validation that her symptoms were real and measurable, but also apprehension about what this meant for her future. "Is this something that can be cured?" Dr. Rodriguez sat down next to the examination table. "POTS isn't typically cured in the traditional sense, but it can absolutely be managed effectively. Many people with POTS live normal, productive lives once they learn how to manage their condition properly." She explained the various treatment approaches available. The foundation of POTS management is usually increased salt and fluid intake, compression garments, and a specific type of exercise program. Many patients also benefit from medications that help regulate heart rate and blood pressure. What kind of exercise program? This is where your experience with Dr. Walsh becomes relevant. Traditional exercise recommendations, especially cardiovascular exercise in upright positions, can worsen POTS symptoms. But there's a specific protocol developed by researchers at major medical centers that starts with recumbent and horizontal exercises and gradually progresses to upright activities as your body adapts. Dr. Rodriguez continued, "The key is starting very slowly and building up your exercise tolerance over months rather than weeks. Swimming and rowing machines are often better choices than treadmills and upright bikes for people with POTS." Sarah thought about all the times she had been criticized for not being able to keep up with traditional exercise routines. So when people were telling me to just push through and exercise more, that advice was actually counterproductive? Potentially, yes. Well, meaning people often don't understand that some medical conditions require modified approaches. The no pain, no gain mentality can be harmful for people with certain chronic illnesses. They discussed other lifestyle modifications that could help manage her symptoms. Compression stockings can help improve blood flow from your legs back to your heart. Increasing your salt intake, which goes against traditional health advice, can help expand your blood volume. Staying hydrated is crucial, and you'll probably need to drink more fluids than the average person. What about medications? We have several options depending on your specific symptoms and how you respond to lifestyle changes. Beta blockers can help control heart rate. Fludrocortisone can help with blood volume. And there are other medications we can consider if needed. Dr. Rodriguez also addressed the temperature regulation issues. The cold intolerance you experience is very common in POTS. Your blood isn't circulating as effectively as it should, which affects temperature regulation. That's why you're always bundled up in that coat. For the first time, Sarah smiled. "Everyone thinks I'm weird for wearing a winter coat in warm weather. You're not weird at all. You're responding appropriately to what your body needs." Many of my POTS patients wear layers year-round because of circulation issues. As the appointment continued, Dr. Rodriguez provided Sarah with educational materials about POTS and connected her with support groups and online communities for people with dysautonomia. Having a support network of people who understand what you're going through can be incredibly valuable. "Will I need to see you regularly?" "I'd like to see you back in about 6 weeks to see how you're responding to the initial treatment recommendations. After that, we can probably space out appointments unless you're having problems." Sarah left the appointment with a formal diagnosis, a treatment plan, prescriptions for compression stockings, and a medication to help with her symptoms and, for the first time in 2 years, a sense of hope about her future. The next day at physical therapy, she arrived early and asked to speak with Dr. Walsh privately before the group session began. "I have news," Sarah announced with a genuine smile. Dr. Rodriguez confirmed it. "I definitely have POTS." Dr. Walsh smiled back. "How do you feel about having a diagnosis?" "Honestly, relieved. It's real, it has a name, and it can be treated. I'm not crazy, I'm not making it up, and I'm not just being lazy." As they discussed the treatment recommendations and how to modify her physical therapy program further, Sarah felt like she was finally on the right path. She was still wearing her winter coat, and she probably would be for the foreseeable future, but now she understood why. More importantly, the people around her were beginning to understand too. When the group session began, Sarah shared her diagnosis with Marcus, Linda, Robert, and the others. Their responses were uniformly supportive and encouraging. "I'm so glad you finally have answers," Linda said. "And I want you to know that you've taught all of us something important about not making assumptions about other people's health." Marcus nodded in agreement. "I feel like an ass for giving you such a hard time before we understood what was going on." "Don't feel bad," Sarah replied. "You couldn't have known. The important thing is that we all learned something from this experience." As Sarah participated in her modified exercise routine that day, focusing on recumbent positions and gentle movements designed specifically for people with dysautonomia, she felt more optimistic about her future than she had in years. The road ahead would still have challenges, but at least now she had a roadmap for navigating them. 3 months after receiving her POTS diagnosis, Sarah was experiencing improvements she had never thought possible. The combination of increased salt and fluid intake, compression stockings, modified exercise, and a low-dose beta blocker had significantly reduced the frequency and severity of her symptoms. She was sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and, for the first time in 2 years, she felt like she had some control over her health. The physical therapy sessions had become a highlight of her week rather than a source of dread. Dr. Walsh had worked closely with Dr. Rodriguez to develop an exercise protocol specifically designed for Sarah's condition, and the results had been remarkable. Her exercise tolerance was gradually improving, and she was able to participate more fully in modified activities. The group dynamics had completely transformed as well. What had once been a source of judgment and criticism had evolved into a supportive community where invisible disabilities were acknowledged and accommodated. Sarah's willingness to share her story had opened up conversations about other hidden struggles within the group. Linda had revealed that she dealt with chronic depression that sometimes made it difficult for her to get out of bed, despite appearing cheerful and energetic during therapy sessions. Robert had shared that he experienced severe anxiety following his skiing accident, which sometimes manifested as panic attacks that he had been hiding from the group. Even Marcus had admitted that he struggled with chronic pain from an old injury that wasn't related to his current back problems, pain that he had been pushing through without telling anyone. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said during one session as they worked through their respective exercise routines. "Before Sarah taught us about invisible disabilities, I thought I was being tough by not talking about my chronic pain. Now I realize I was just making things harder for myself and probably sending the wrong message to others who might be struggling." The group had developed an informal system of checking in with each other and offering support when someone was having a difficult day. They had learned to recognize that participation and effort could look very different depending on someone's condition and current symptom levels. But despite all the positive changes in her life, Sarah continued to wear her heavy winter coat to every session. It had become such an integral part of her identity in the group that no one questioned it anymore. Dr. Walsh had explained to the others that temperature regulation issues were common in POTS, so Sarah's need for extra layers was completely understandable. On this particular Tuesday morning in early spring, Sarah arrived at the physical therapy session feeling better than she had in months. Her symptoms were well controlled. She had slept through the night without interruption, and she had even been able to walk to the community center instead of taking the bus, a small victory that represented significant progress in her condition management. As the group gathered for their usual warm-up routine, Dr. Walsh made an announcement. "I have some exciting news to share with everyone. This is actually going to be Sarah's last session with our group." The announcement was met with surprised looks and immediate concern from the other group members. "Is everything okay?" Linda asked quickly. "Are your symptoms getting worse?" Sarah smiled and shook her head. "Actually, everything is much better. Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Walsh both agree that I've progressed to the point where I can transition to a regular fitness program designed specifically for people with POTS. I'll still need to be careful and follow certain guidelines, but I don't need supervised medical rehabilitation anymore." The group erupted in cheers and congratulations. Marcus stood up from his exercise mat and started a round of applause that everyone joined enthusiastically. "This is incredible news," Robert said. "You've come so far from where you were when you first started coming here." "We all have," Sarah replied. "But I want you to know that you've all been such an important part of my recovery. Not just the physical improvement, but the emotional support and understanding you've shown me. It's made all the difference." Dr. Walsh wiped away a tear that had formed in her eye. "Sarah, you've been an inspiration to all of us. Your courage in sharing your story and advocating for yourself has not only helped your own recovery, but has made this entire group more compassionate and understanding." As they moved through the session, there was a celebratory atmosphere that was infectious. Everyone seemed to be putting a little extra effort into their exercises, inspired by Sarah's progress and success. During the cool-down portion of the session, Linda brought up something that had been on several people's minds. "Sarah, I hope this isn't too personal to ask, but I've always wondered about that coat you wear. I know you have temperature regulation issues because of your POTS, but even on really warm days, you're bundled up. Is there more to it than just staying warm?" Sarah looked around the circle at these people who had become so much more than fellow patients. They had become friends and allies who had supported her through one of the most challenging periods of her life. She felt a sudden urge to share something with them that she had never shared with anyone. "You're right that I wear it partly because of temperature issues," Sarah said slowly. "But that's not the whole story." She paused for a moment, gathering her courage. "The truth is, this coat has become like armor for me. When I was at my sickest, when no one believed what I was going through, when I felt like my body was betraying me every single day, this coat was the one thing that made me feel safe and protected." The group listened intently as Sarah continued. "I started wearing it constantly about 1.5 years ago, during the worst period of my undiagnosed illness. I felt so vulnerable and exposed, like everyone was watching me and judging me for things I couldn't control. This coat became my hiding place." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I think I can understand that. When I was at my lowest point with my back injury, I had a lucky shirt that I wore to every doctor's appointment. It didn't actually do anything, but it made me feel like I had some control over an uncontrollable situation." "Exactly," Sarah said. "And even after getting my diagnosis and starting to feel better, I was afraid to stop wearing it. What if my symptoms came back? What if people started judging me again? What if taking off the coat somehow made me vulnerable again?" Dr. Walsh leaned forward slightly. "That makes perfect sense, Sarah. When you've been through trauma, and medical trauma is very real, it's natural to want to hold on to things that provided comfort and security during that difficult time." Sarah looked down at her coat, running her fingers over the familiar fabric. "But I think I'm finally ready to let go of needing it as protection. I still need layers because of my circulation issues, but I don't need armor anymore." The group watched in respectful silence as Sarah slowly unzipped her heavy winter coat. Underneath, she was wearing a light cardigan and a t-shirt, normal clothing that no one would think twice about. But as she slipped the coat off her shoulders, something unexpected became visible. Along both of her arms, from her wrists to her elbows, were dozens of small, circular scars and what appeared to be medical device marks. Linda gasped softly, and Robert's eyes widened in surprise. Even Dr. Walsh looked taken aback by what they were seeing. Sarah noticed their reactions and realized they were seeing something she had successfully hidden for over a year. "I guess there's one more part of my story that I haven't shared with you," she said quietly. She rolled up her sleeves fully, revealing the extent of the markings on her arms. "These are from all the medical procedures and tests I went through while trying to get a diagnosis. Blood draws, for lines, heart monitors, allergy testing, nerve conduction studies, the list goes on and on." The scars and marks told a visual story of the medical odyssey Sarah had endured. There were small puncture wounds from countless needle sticks, rectangular marks from electrode placements, larger scars from more invasive procedures, and areas of discoloration from medical adhesives and tape. "This is why I couldn't take my coat off," Sarah continued, her voice getting stronger. "It wasn't just about temperature regulation or feeling emotionally protected. I was also hiding the physical evidence of everything I'd been through. I was embarrassed by how my arms looked, and I was afraid people would think I was a drug user or that I was deliberately harming myself." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "Sarah, I had no idea you had gone through so much medical testing. How many procedures did you have? I lost count after about 30, Sarah replied. Between the time my symptoms started and when I finally got diagnosed with POTS, I saw 12 different doctors, had 4 different types of scans, wore 3 different types of monitors, had blood drawn more times than I can remember, and underwent several procedures that required sedation. She pointed to a particularly prominent scar near her elbow. This one is from a nerve biopsy that was supposed to check for small fiber neuropathy. This cluster here is from when they had to try 5 different times to get in 4-line placed for a cardiac stress test. These rectangular marks are from wearing heart monitors for weeks at a time. Dr. Walsh looked genuinely emotional as she processed this revelation. Sarah, I'm so sorry you went through all of that. And I'm sorry you felt like you had to hide it from us. I wasn't ashamed of trying to get help, Sarah clarified. I was proud of advocating for myself and pursuing a diagnosis. But I was ashamed of how the process had marked my body, and I was afraid of people making assumptions about what the scars meant. Linda reached over and gently touched one of the scars on Sarah's arm. Honey, these aren't something to be ashamed of. They're battle scars. They're proof that you fought for your health and didn't give up when things got difficult. Robert nodded in agreement. They tell the story of your strength, not your weakness. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. But for the first time in months, they were tears of relief rather than frustration or sadness. You know what the strangest part is? I was so worried about people judging me for these marks. But now that you've seen them and know what they represent, I feel more understood than ever. Dr. Walsh stood up and walked over to Sarah. Would it be all right if I gave you a hug? Sarah nodded, and Dr. Walsh wrapped her in a warm embrace. You are one of the bravest people I've ever had the privilege to work with. Your journey has taught all of us so much about perseverance, advocacy, and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. As the session drew to a close, the group spent time reflecting on everything they had learned from Sarah's experience and from each other. They talked about the importance of believing people when they say they're struggling, the need for greater awareness about invisible disabilities, and the power of community support in the healing process. I want to stay in touch with all of you, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. This group has become like family to me, and I don't want to lose that connection just because I'm transitioning to a different type of program. Marcus pulled out his phone. Let's exchange numbers. And maybe we can meet up for coffee once a month or something. As Sarah walked toward the exit of the community center, carrying her winter coat over her arm instead of wearing it, she felt lighter than she had in years. The physical weight of the heavy coat was nothing compared to the emotional weight of the secrets and shame she had been carrying. Dr. Walsh called out to her before she reached the door. Sarah, wait a moment. Sarah turned around to see Dr. Walsh approaching with a small wrapped package. This is just a little something to commemorate your graduation from our program, Dr. Walsh said, handing her the gift. But more than that, it's a reminder of how far you've come and how much strength you've shown. Sarah unwrapped the package to find a beautiful lightweight scarf in soft blues and greens. It's gorgeous, she said, immediately wrapping it around her shoulders. And it's perfect, warm enough for my circulation issues, but light enough that I won't feel like I'm hiding behind it. As Sarah walked home that afternoon, wearing her new scarf and carrying her old coat, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The path from undiagnosed illness to proper treatment had been long and difficult, filled with frustration, judgment, and moments of despair. But it had also been a journey of self-discovery, advocacy, and ultimately, healing. She had learned to speak up for herself, to seek out medical professionals who would listen and believe her, and to find community with others who understood invisible struggles. Most importantly, she had learned that vulnerability and transparency, while scary, could lead to deeper connections and greater understanding than hiding ever could. The winter coat that had protected her for so long would always represent an important chapter in her story. But as she walked into her future, warmed by her new scarf and surrounded by the support of people who truly understood her journey, Sarah knew she was ready for whatever came next.